Okay, welcome to our Seriously Social School Programs webinar, Learning about Australian Politics. Now, the Seriously Social School Program is part of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia, which is home to more than 700 leading experts in our nation in all areas of social sciences. And one of those experts is Dr Linda Botterill, who we're fortunate enough to have with us today. And Linda, it's my absolute pleasure to invite you to speak with our students and teachers about Australian politics to help us understand what this is all about and how it relates to our lives today and into the future. Thank you for your time, Linda, and welcome to Seriously Social.
Thank you very much, Cindy. It's a delight to be here. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that I am talking to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country in the Australian Capital Territory, and acknowledge the owners of territories right across Australia where people are watching this video. So to start, why are we even asking about politics? Why do we bother talking about it? In general, most people don't seem to like politics very much. If you raise politics in a party, people will roll their eyes at you. And they certainly don't seem to have very much time for politicians. So why bother? Well, one way of thinking about it is that we live in a shared community. Imagine if you're living in a share house with 2 or 3 friends. Unless you're an extraordinary group of people, you'll disagree about how that arrangement might work. How do you divide up the household chores? Well, first of all, how clean do you think the house should be? How much mess are you happy to live with? Will there be rules about guests or pets? Resolving these questions is a form of interpersonal politics, where you negotiate amongst yourselves how these questions will be answered. Do you put them to the vote, or do you just discuss it until you can reach an agreement with a few compromises? Or do you just decide you're all exhausted and just go with the first best solution that comes up? This is essentially what politics is about. It's about members of our community making decisions about how we live together. At a national level, these decisions are taken through formal institutions like the Parliament, where different ideas are debated and different solutions put forward to the problems under discussion. The questions include how we look after the most vulnerable in our community, how do we defend ourselves, how do we address challenges like climate change. But at the bottom of this, it's quite basic. Roads and things like that have to be delivered as a collective. Otherwise, rich people would have bits of road outside their houses, and then there wouldn't be any roads elsewhere for people to drive on. So we need to agree to collectively deliver these things that we all rely on to make our communities function. And these solutions need to be paid for. So just as in a share house, everyone puts money into some form of kitty to cover shared expenses like the electricity bill and the rent, in national politics, people contribute to a central kitty by paying taxes. In your share house, you might disagree whether the person with the biggest bedroom should pay more rent. You might also disagree whether the kitty should cover basic foodstuffs like milk and bread, or whether each individual is responsible for buying all their own food. But then who pays for the toilet paper? In national politics, people argue over who should pay what type of taxes, how much tax, and what that money should be spent on. Should people who are rich pay more as a proportion of the taxes than people who are not so well off? So our political system is about choosing what we do with the collective money and how we spend it, and what issues the government should even be thinking about in the first place. So in Australia, we make the decision about who should choose for us through an election. In some countries, the structure of the electoral system makes it easy for politicians and their supporters to manipulate the result in their own favour. They can make it hard to register to vote. They can make it hard for particular groups in the community to register to vote or turn up on polling day. They can manipulate the boundaries of electorates, a process called gerrymandering, to exclude areas, including people they don't think will vote for them, and including those who will. So an electoral system isn't neutral. It's designed in a way that can steer the result in a particular direction. But in Australia, we have probably the fairest and most transparent electoral system in the world. And it has three key features that make it stand out. The first one is compulsory voting. The second is an independent Australian Electoral Commission. And the third is preferential voting. Compulsory voting means everyone has a say. And because everyone has to turn up to vote, we make it really easy for them to vote. Polling booths are all over the place on election day in Australia, and you can vote anywhere in the country. The Electoral Commission goes out of its way to ensure even the most remote communities can vote in a federal election. You can also vote in advance of the election if you don't want to on polling day, or you're going to be away or you're working. Although a disadvantage of that is you don't get to have a democracy sausage. We vote on a Saturday in Australia to avoid too many people being left out of the process because they have to work. In the US, for example, they vote on a Tuesday. Well, that would be most inconvenient for people who work or are students. If you don't vote in Australia, you will attract a small fine. And some libertarians argue that compulsory voting is wrong because it forces people to vote who may not want to participate in the electoral process and don't want to vote. But remember, it's only compulsory to turn up and have your name crossed off the electoral roll and to go into the booth and mark a ballot paper. But it's not compulsory to not mess it up and write Sam Kerr or Pat Cummings for Prime Minister if you don't like any of the choices on offer. So the compulsory nature of the voting isn't really that onerous, and so many polling booths in Australia on election day have a real carnival feel about them, with local schools raising money through their sausage sizzles, people running cake stores, and people turning up with their dogs to help them vote. Our Independent Electoral Commission is really important in keeping the process fair. They run the election. They draw the boundaries around electorates so that they can't be distorted by politicians to their own advantage. And they update these boundaries on a regular basis. So if there's population movements or new suburbs popping up, they can take that into account when they draw the boundaries. They also count the votes when they come in to ensure that every vote counts and is allocated to the correct candidate. So they have an extremely important role in safeguarding our democracy. Preferential voting might sound complex, and I'm not going to go into the details here, but it's really important. It means that if your first preference, the person you want to elect to hold your seat, doesn't get over 50% of the vote, your next preference will count. So that means your first choice might not make it, but your second choice might. In a system without preferential voting, it's possible for a candidate to win an election while the majority of people in the electorate voted against them. In Australia, it's possible for somebody to win where not everybody put them first, but at least people thought, well, if I can't get my first choice, you'll do. So how do we know who to vote for? Well, research tells us that people vote according to their values, what they consider to be the most important things that should be done by government. So political parties tend to represent different sets of values, and their policy platforms indicate what their priorities will be if they are elected. We know, for example, that the Greens prioritise environmental and social issues, and the National Party are interested in issues that impact rural communities and rural industries. So when the Greens, if ever they are in majority government, are dividing up that kitty, they're going to be spending more money on environmental concerns than they will on the concerns perhaps that would drive the Liberal or Labor parties. So we have basically two major parties in Australia, although the coalition is in fact a coalition of two parties. Labor is the oldest political party in Australia, and its origins were actually, ironically, in rural Australia, and they emerged from great shearers' strikes of the 1890s. The coalition, which is currently in place, is made up of the National Party, formerly the Country Party, which is also a very old institution. It's been around for over 100 years. And for most of that time, it's been in government in coalition with the Liberal Party and its predecessors. So to all intents and purposes, Australia has had for a very long time a two-party system with the Labor Party on one side and the Liberal National Party on the other. But in recent years, we've seen voters shifting. They're moving more towards independent candidates and minor parties. You may have heard of the Teal candidates who are economically more inclined towards the Liberal Party, but are very concerned about the environment. And we've also seen in recent years the rise of minor parties, like Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party. These independents and minor parties are becoming increasingly important in Australia as people move away from supporting the larger old-style political parties. Now, there are advantages and disadvantages to a strong two-party system. When there are just two parties and people vote for them, there's a great deal of stability. Most people know who they want to vote for. And going back to my earlier point about people furthering their values through their voting behaviour, people tend to be what they describe as rusted on to political parties. Very few people spend their life voting Labor and then suddenly change their mind. It has to take something quite profound to make them do that. And a two-party system does provide stability because we know what we're going to get. The disadvantage is that alternative voices don't necessarily get very much of a hearing because the two big parties dominate the election campaign to such an extent that independents and others don't necessarily get to be heard sufficiently. So beyond the politicians that we vote for, politics is about a national discussion. It's not just about electing people and forgetting about them for 3 years until next time they ask us to vote for them. An important group that plays a really important role in politics is the media. And we have quite a complex media landscape now, much more complex than it used to be. For a very long time, we have had an independent government-funded Australian Broadcasting Corporation. And that is intended to provide a bit of a counterbalance to the commercially owned television networks. Because they're commercially owned, the owners of those networks have quite a bit of power in terms of the content that they promote and the political parties they support. The ABC is expected to be more neutral, although often the right of politics criticises Labor for the ABC for being too much to the left and too pro-Labor. In recent years, though, we've seen the rise of new media, and this has thoroughly disrupted the political landscape. In the last election, we saw a lot of media influencers getting a lot of airtime through TikTok and other forms of digital media, putting their views about politics. And these were voices that previously wouldn't have been heard during the course of an election campaign. Those election campaigns were previously highly choreographed and coordinated by the political parties to put out very particular messages. But the introduction of digital media has shaken that up quite a bit. Also important in politics are the role of various types of interest groups. So the first, you perhaps have heard the expression lobby groups. These are groups that can get quite easy access to politicians to promote the interests of their members. So we have industry associations like the Business Council of Australia, or industry associations representing the mining industry, or various rural industries like the National Farmers Federation. They have a role throughout the political cycle of ensuring that the interests of their members are at front of mind for politicians making decisions that are relevant to them. So the CEO of the National Farmers Federation is frequently visiting the office of the Minister for Agriculture to talk about policies that will impact on their members. Another important type of interest group are the trade unions, who represent workers in various industries. Many of the members of the Labor Party have come through leadership positions in the trade union movement, the best known of which is the Australian Council of Trade Unions, the ACTU. And then, of course, there are environmental groups like the Australian Conservation Foundation that are also lobbying government to take the environment into account when they're forming policy positions. Outside of that are social and protest movements. And in the academic literature that looks at this, they talk about insider groups and outsider groups. So insider groups are interest groups and lobby groups who have easy access to politicians and to public servants who are making policy, and most of their work is done behind closed doors. Outsider groups get their impact by protest. So they might paint a slogan on the sails of the Sydney Opera House. They might lead a street march or a protest march on an issue that they feel needs to get public attention that's not getting enough, in their view, through traditional ways of influencing politicians. So the state of Australian politics today. Well, we hear a lot about decreasing faith in political parties. That could just be a reflection of the two old parties not being very happy that there's a rise in minor parties and a rise in independents. The independents may, in many cases, provide more accurate views of what's happening in their individual electorates. And this may not necessarily serve the purposes of the big parties. So concern about the decreasing faith in political parties is actually a two-edged sword. Decreasing faith in politicians, well, that's very Australian in my view, for us to be cutting down our tall poppies and for us to not take our politicians too seriously. And I think it's very healthy that we are prepared to critique our politicians and make sure that they're up to the job. And finally, we're seeing quite a lot of polarisation around particular issues. There seems to be more anger in Australian politics than there used to be, and there seem to be more personal attacks. And in fact, only a few weeks before I recorded this video, we saw the Prime Minister having to leave the Lodge because there was a bomb threat made against his home at the Lodge. This is a change in Australian politics. It could be a reflection of general more polarisation in the community around particular issues. It could also be a reflection of the rise of the digital media and the fact that people can express far more extreme views through digital media than they could through traditional media. Or it could just be a phase, because at the moment we have some pretty hot topics that are exciting people's imagination. So I've just included here some resources that might be useful for you in terms of understanding a bit more about Australian politics. The Australian Electoral Commission website has got the results of the last election, plus it's also got some details about Australia's individual federal electorates. And students can have a look at that and work out which federal electorate they will be in when they are old enough to vote. Annabelle Crabb's Civic Duty is a very entertaining three-part television series that examines those three important characteristics of Australian politics that I explained, and includes some lovely interviews with the head of the Australian Electoral Commission describing his job in and leading up to election day. And it's really worth watching because I learned a lot from it, and I think the students would too. And finally, there is an open access textbook, Australian Politics and Policy, which is exactly what it says it is and is worth having a brief look at. Thank you very much, Cindy, for the opportunity.
Thank you, Linda. What great information you've provided. And what, like you said, lots of double-edged swords going on when we think about Australian politics, the affirmative and the negative. There's a lot to really dig deep into and position yourself either side of debating whether or not Australian politics are in fact, or is in fact rather, alive and well. I do have some questions that have come in where people are interested to seek your expert opinion, please. So if I can read some of these out for you to respond to, that would be fantastic.
Sure, happy to.
Thank you. Could you help us understand, does one person's vote really make any difference? What are your thoughts?
This is one of the features of Australian politics, which is fascinating, is that there is the phenomenon, particularly in the days when the two main political party blocks were at their most powerful, when the phenomenon of safe seats, where the way the boundaries were, the way people congregated within those boundaries, that there were safe Labor seats and safe Liberal seats and safe National Party seats. And that's kind of where your question comes from, I think, is that people who live in a safe seat often feel like, why do I bother? Because Labor's always going to win, or the Nats are always going to win, or Liberals are always going to win. And I have to say that's crossed my mind living in Canberra, where some of our seats are the very safest in the country, but they're not always safe. So we have seen prime ministers lose their seats in elections when their governments have been turfed out. We have seen the last election and the one before were really good examples of people being in so-called safe seats, losing those seats because the whole of the population had turned to such an extent against the government of the day that even people in those safe seats thought, no, I'm not going to support them. And in the seats where the so-called Teals, the independents, have had some success, those have often been seats that were previously seen as safe. Probably the safest of the safe seats in Australia at the moment would be National Party seats, because they've consistently held about 9, 10 or 11 seats for a very long time. And it doesn't look like it's going to change quickly, but with the Nationals, when they do lose a seat, they very rarely win it back. So your vote can make a difference.
Yeah, okay. So you would encourage young people to get involved and cast their votes?
Absolutely, because the demographic profile of the electorate is important as well. So if more and more young people vote, more and more of the issues that are of concern to them will be taken account of either by candidates who are running purely on those issues, like a Greens candidate in the case of climate change. But if a lot of young people are coming in and voicing concern about climate change, the big parties are going to rethink their party platforms. They're going to respond, and they're going to start thinking, we need to win over the young vote. What are the issues that are of concern to them, and what do we need to do with our policy positions?
Perfect, thank you. You spoke a lot about the media and you gave a lot of great examples there. Just one broad question. Do you think social media and 24/7 news cycle has influenced politics over time?
I think actually, if I look back, and I'm going to go back a long way, if I look back over the last 30 years, it has changed the landscape of the way politicians deal with issues. So I was very fortunate 30 odd years ago to work as an advisor in a ministerial office in the Keating government. And we had a media advisor who carefully managed the access that those ministers had to the media. The media received briefings at a time in the policy process that suited the minister. Ministers weren't constantly getting microphones stuck in front of their faces 24/7 and having to answer things they hadn't thought through. On top of that, the interaction between people in Parliament and outside Parliament was much more closely managed. So in one of my roles in an industry association, if we wanted to get a message out to the broad community, we would print out press releases. We would take them up to Parliament House and physically put them in pigeon boxes in the press gallery. So everyone in the press gallery received a hard copy of our press release, and they would have piles of these press releases, which someone in their office went through and decided whether they were going to act on them. But now it's coming through on Twitter and X, it's coming through on LinkedIn, it's coming through on the digital media. And because the media now have to fill a news cycle, because even the conventional media are on social media. So if I look on the ABC News app on my telephone, I see just in breaking news. Well, in the days where you had one, sometimes two runs of a newspaper, you didn't need to have stuff hot off the press every 30 seconds to keep eyes on your website. And if you're in commercial media, eyes on your website means eyes on the advertisers, the products the advertisers are trying to sell you. So there's immense pressure as a consequence of both social media and the 24/7 news cycle on the media to be gathering information and for the politicians to be responding. But I think added to that is that we see less and less really solid investigative journalism on political topics. So again, going back several decades, the ABC and 60 Minutes would run stories that they had spent months doing background research on that were important stories for our political system to understand. But there's just a very strong sense now that they don't have the time to do that as thoroughly as they once did.
Interesting. And so what advice would you give young people about where they're gaining their information when it comes to politics?
Well, I think certainly beginning with the conventional media, although I do sound like I'm a bit down on it, I think start with media that has got a good reputation. If you're picking up your information, political information through digital media, do a little bit of background. Who are the people who are giving you this information? What's driving that? Just drop into Wikipedia and see if what they're telling you is true about whether it's about a celebrity's lifestyle or a politician's background. Just make sure that you ground truth what you're seeing and hearing in some form of reality. And inform yourself about the functioning of the Australian political system so that you know what you're hearing and whether it sounds like it's likely to be right.
So really important to get a few different sources and compare them and think who put this together, what's their qualification, what's their motivation before taking on board that information that you're receiving. Great advice, thank you. And then my final question is, what do you think about the behaviours of Australian politicians toward one another?
Well, I think quite a bit of it is theatre. So one of the things I learnt when I worked in Parliament House was the difference in the mood and the manners of politicians when they were in question time and the cameras were on them and it was going out into the nightly news, as against when they were in committees in the Senate debating legislation, or they were having debates around matters of public importance, or any other form of debate that wasn't necessarily going to be going out on the evening news. So there were different audiences for their speech and their interaction. Question time, the audience is the public. The audience are the journalists in the galleries who are going to write the stories. The audience is people in your home electorate. So often in question time is very orchestrated so that people know in advance they're going to get the opportunity to ask the government a question. And they can then go back to their electorate and say, I asked a question in question time. Here you can see that in Hansard. But once they get into a committee discussion around a piece of legislation, for example, their audience is other politicians and they're trying to work their way through the issues. So those conversations are nowhere near as robust and as entertaining as question time. But you also see situations where politicians, even in question time, choose how they're going to respond to particular questions. So again, going back to my experience in a minister's office 30 years ago, I had a minister who got a question from a member of the opposition and he didn't go in hard on it. He just, there used to be telephones underneath the desks on the floor of Parliament. And I got a call in the office saying, Linda, can you make sure you've got an answer to that question by the end of question time? And this was a question coming from an opponent. And it was because my minister realised that that question was not politically motivated in terms of scoring points, but it was a genuine question on behalf of that member's electorate, and that we would provide a genuine answer. So there's a distinction between the gotcha moments of the opposition asking a question for performative purposes as against the responses when the question is a genuine question requiring a quick and genuine response.
Thank you so much for those insights. That's really interesting to know and to get that insider information from you, Linda. Thank you. Look, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for providing us with all of this knowledge in such an easy to understand way. It's such a great way to compare the huge topic of Australian politics to a share house, which most young people in Australia at some stage may very well experience. So yes, thank you for making it so easy to understand, and thank you for being your wonderful, energetic, passionate self. We really loved having you here to talk with us on Seriously Social. Thanks, Linda.
Thank you.